Welcome to the first ever Transformed podcast. My name is Luke Broyles, and I'm honored here to be here with my friend Nick Toomey. Nick is a pastor, missionary, and home church planter who has been heavily involved with the organization Big Life for many years, especially in the last few years here. Big Life is a nonprofit organization that provides humanitarian aid, shelter against persecution, and church planting to over 140 nations around the world. And the reason I'm speaking to Nick today is because Nick has just returned yesterday, I believe, from a military base with thousands of Afghan refugees. So, Nick, I'm humbled that you're here with me, and thank you for being here. Really appreciate it.
I'm glad to be with you, Luke. And just one quick point of clarification with regard to Big Life. Yes, we do plant churches and so forth, but we would say we are first and foremost a disciple-making ministry. So our strategy is not to send American missionaries abroad. That's been tried for a long, long time. And it's probably a kind of a dirty little secret in the world of missions, but it's never really worked all that well. It's very expensive to send American missionaries. And I know we'll get into the Afghan thing here quickly, but just for those who are listening, on average, the average American missionary going abroad spends 6 years in preparation. And again, there's exceptions to this. There are people who go to foreign mission fields and have a long, fruitful career, but on average, they spend 2 years on the field and don't see a single person come to faith in Christ, and they come back. And it's very expensive. So what Big Life does is we go into countries, we go into areas, and we look for, this is your name, Luke. We look for the Luke 10, because right there in the Gospel of Luke, Luke chapter 10, verses 1 through 11, where Jesus sent people out in groups of 2. And he said, when you go into the village, look for the person of peace. So that's our whole disciple-making strategy, is we empower local believers, or we, if they're not a believer, we lead them into a relationship with Jesus, and then we equip them so they can reach and disciple their own people, which is exactly what we did in Pakistan and Afghanistan. So we plant churches, but primarily we make disciples, and then those disciples multiply. They gather together in simple churches that meet in homes or under a tree or someplace. I mean, if you had big buildings in many parts of the world, first of all, they don't have the resources. Secondly, they would be killed.
Yeah, that's very true. Thanks for clarifying that. I really appreciate that. From the get-go, everything I've seen from Big Life has appeared to be, how do I put this, quite different than other organizations. So I'm glad you clarified that from the start. So, Nick, I know that you just returned yesterday, or was it this morning, actually?
It was yesterday.
Yesterday. Okay. I know you returned yesterday from a military base where there are Afghan refugees coming in, and you've been there for about a week, if I understand correctly. And so I'm really curious if you could just give us a quick, I know that a lot's going on that a lot of us are not aware of. And so I would really appreciate it if you would go into detail a little bit about what is happening over in Afghanistan, what is happening here in the United States, and what are we missing that many of us are frankly not, just everything that we've talked about on our calls and everything.
Sure. Well, let's start with the country of Afghanistan itself, like what's going on over there, because you're right, Luke, that how the U.S. news cycle is. There's always, it's 24 to 48 hours, and we've moved on to the next thing. The humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan is absolutely catastrophic. A New York Times article that I read recently, and I'm not a big fan of the New York Times in general, but I think they've got this one right. They're saying that 50% of the country right now is facing starvation. And I've had that confirmed by the Afghan, on the US military bases, they are referred to as guests. And so the Afghan refugees or guests have confirmed that it's that bad. So the Taliban has taken over the country, and it is absolute chaos. There are still about 60,000 translators that worked with the U.S. government, whose lives are in absolute imminent danger. There are still Americans trapped behind enemy lines. One of the interesting things is the Big Life disciples. So we have about 1,200 underground churches in Afghanistan. And it all started, the whole thing started from one jihadist about 10 years ago, one jihadist from Pakistan who was on his way to Afghanistan, basically to kill Americans. And through when I say miraculous visit from God, I mean like miraculous. This one man decided to follow Jesus. He immediately led 5 other jihadists who were all from the tribal areas where Osama bin Laden is from, led them to Christ. And from there, we now have about 1,800 underground churches in Pakistan. It's spilled over into the Afghan border. So we have, I don't know if there's 1,200 underground churches in Afghanistan. Let's just say, for conversation's sake, that each group has 10 people in it.
Yeah,
That would be
yeah.
about 12,000,
All
12
right,
to
yeah, I was just doing the
15,000.
math in my head. That's
Yeah, yeah.
incredible.
So we've got all these disciples in Afghanistan, and their lives are all in danger. In fact, we've had many of our disciples in Afghanistan martyred, in both Pakistan and Afghanistan. But here's one of the crazy things. Big Life's disciples in Afghanistan, they're not going anywhere. When all of the U.S. ministries pulled out, when Kabul fell, our guys are, and women, they're not going anywhere because they're home. So
Mm.
every day, these former Muslims who are now followers of Jesus are risking their lives to help Afghans targeted for execution by the Taliban either get across the border into Pakistan, which is very expensive and very dangerous. We've gotten, I think, between 2,000 and 3,000 people across the border, but we've also relocated well over 10,000 Afghan citizens into safer parts of Afghanistan. When I say safer, it's all relative.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden, our disciple makers who are trying to reach and disciple other Afghans, they've had to pivot, and they're basically, I have gotten word from U.S. intelligence sources that there are real, true life, Jason Bourne life things happening every day, like crazy stuff happening every day in Afghanistan. And you would think that it's the former Navy SEALs, Green Berets, the former special ops guys who are working behind the scenes. Those are the guys who are telling us, no, it's these ordinary Afghan men and women who are risking their lives. They know the culture, they know the land. So they not only are they bearing witness to how Jesus changed their lives, but they're risking their lives to save the lives of people targeted by the Taliban. So it's very difficult. It's very overwhelming, and yet the good news in that is that God is moving in extraordinary ways. I suspect it's going to be a while before we get the detailed stories. When I say detailed stories, when we're able to tell these stories, I'm sure we'll have to change names, blur out pictures, and
Yeah.
so forth. But we have hundreds, if not thousands, of stories of ordinary men and women in the hands of an extraordinary God, literally risking their lives. And we know those stories are being formed every single day. So inside Afghanistan, it's a dire, desperate situation. But God has not abandoned the Afghan people. There are Afghan followers of Jesus who are bringing his love and his compassion as best they can in an overwhelming situation. Yeah. And that situation in Afghanistan is not going to go away overnight. It's probably going to be 2 to 3 years at least before things settle down, and even I have no idea what that even looks like.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. The fact that former perpetrators of violence are entering the country to start churches and bring people to faith and be makers of peace, and then likewise send people out of the country. I just find that really poetic, and a sort of bittersweet irony. Um, but before we go into more of what exactly Big Life is doing, I hesitate to ask because honestly, there are some things we don't want to know, but I think it's important, especially for us Americans and Westerners that are pretty spoiled to our lifestyle
Hmm.
and our comfort. Could you give us a synopsis of what the situation looks like in terms of the specific horrors? I know we were talking about we can't go into specifics of individual or anything like that, obviously, but what exactly are the kinds of persecution or kinds of violence that people are facing, and what exactly has changed in the last few months? I know that obviously the last few months have been especially brutal as compared to
Hmm.
history, but could you give us a little insight into what exactly the oppression people are facing so that we can better understand when we talk about what the church is doing in light of this oppression, that we can better appreciate it?
Yeah. Well, there are confirmed reports of people having their cell phones taken by the Taliban, and if they are found to have any kind of like a Bible app or whatever, they are executed on the spot. So that would be an extreme situation. You being a filmmaker, Luke, I don't know if you even know this, but we created a short film, 16-minute film that depicts exactly what you're asking, what kind of suffering. There is a gentleman from, this is not Afghanistan, but the bordering country of Pakistan. Um, Hafiz is not his real name, but that's the name of the film, Hafiz. And it was shot at the Blue Cloud Studio in Santa Clarita, California. So we had a professional screenwriter, professional actors, the whole deal. And all the money for this film was raised in Northern Michigan. In fact,
Hmm.
I raised the money, and it tells the story of a Hafiz who is one of our key disciple makers, and how he was kidnapped and tortured not once but twice. And we wanted to avoid gratuitous violence in the film. And the filmmaker, Randy Brewer, he owns Revolution Pictures out of Nashville. They did a great job of depicting the kind of violence that many of our disciples have to endure: beatings, electrocution, um, all of that kind of stuff. And the whole idea is we are going to, day after day after day, torture people until they deny Jesus. And as soon as they do that, they kill them. So I don't think you've seen the film, but I would be happy to show it to you because it does a fantastic job. We can't just distribute it because the material is so sensitive
Mhm.
that, if it falls into the wrong hands, it could potentially endanger our disciple makers in Pakistan and possibly even Afghanistan. But for those who are listening, there are people in many, many countries, dozens of countries, who have been beaten, imprisoned, starved, electrocuted. Um, the woman who leads the Big Life movement in the country of Bhutan, it's a woman. I met her, and my wife saw the wounds on her body. Her husband stabbed her probably 30 times, cut her open multiple times before he died. So there are people who pay a heavy price for following Jesus, and yet every one of them considers it an honor.
Yeah, that's really incredible. As far as you said this earlier, and I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. You said that 50%, according to the New York Times and according to the individuals that you met on base, 50% essentially of Afghanistan is starving. And I'm 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 curious, is that happening now? Is that projected? Is that
No, that's happening now. That's happening now. If things don't change, and of course the United States, I just heard that the U.S. government has frozen Afghan assets, and Afghanistan economy already was bad, but they don't have access to capital. I think that part of what's going on is they had I don't know what crops they grow and when they harvest, but apparently it wasn't very good this time. So I talked to 2 days ago, I talked to a gentleman at the U.S. Army base I was at, and he served for 22 years, and he was over in Afghanistan. He sends an Afghan friend $50 every 2 weeks for food, so $100 a month. And he said pretty soon it's not going to matter how much money he sends him because there will not be any food, period. It's not about money, even though their inflation is running out of control.
Mm-hmm.
It's literally there will be no food. So it's bad. And Big Life is working to secure food and aid. We are actually running a refugee camp in Pakistan, and those 10 to 12,000 Afghans who have been relocated inside the country, we're feeding them. Now,
Mm-hmm.
I don't even know how we are getting the food in. I don't know how that's all.
Well, it has to be kept secret,
Yeah,
essentially,
yeah.
right? Mm-hmm.
Yes, yeah. And so, but I can tell you that that we are playing a direct role. And it's sort of funny because Big Life is not really a humanitarian organization. We're a
Yeah.
disciple making / church planting. But when you're facing crises like this, you just have to stop and say, God, we have to step into the chaos. We have to do what we have to do. And it's crazy because this is not in our annual budget, which is why we've created an Afghan crisis relief fund within Big Life. So I don't know how we're acquiring the food, but I can tell you with absolute certainty that
That it's happening.
it's happening every day, and it's extremely risky. But hey, that's kind of our thing. We just, having been our own lives having been radically impacted by the love of Jesus, we're committed to share his love no matter the cost.
Yeah, that's powerful. Could you go into detail about the fort, the base that you were just at? And I know you can't go into specifics, and
Yeah.
you kind of got in trouble for that, or more or less before. But could you just just detail for us a little bit what exactly is going on? Because this base was within the United States. So,
Yeah.
what's the process? Where are they coming from? Where are they going? What exactly were
Yeah.
you and
Well,
Big Life
I don't
providing
think
there?
I don't think that the bases is private information. But
Yeah.
so I was at Fort McCoy in
Yeah.
Wisconsin.
Mm-hmm.
The first and how we got involved in this was a crazy serendipitous deal. 3 of our Big Life guys were down south of Indianapolis. There's a camp called Camp Atterbury, and
Yeah.
so
Mm-hmm.
there are Afghan refugees on 8 U.S. military bases: Camp Atterbury in Indianapolis, Fort McCoy in Wisconsin, Fort Dix in New Jersey. There's one in New Mexico, one in Texas, 2 in Virginia. So there's 8 of them, and I would guess probably 75,000 refugees that were able to get out as that whole fiasco in Kabul was occurring. So the whole idea now is that the U.S. government is working with states, and the states are working with counties and cities to relocate these Afghan refugees and get them started on a new life in the U.S. But it doesn't happen overnight. It takes time. And so you've got large numbers. In fact, at Fort McCoy, they went from 0 refugees to 13,000 in 16 days.
Wow.
And Fort McCoy is right between 2 very small Wisconsin towns. Each town is maybe 10,000.
Yeah.
10,000 in these neighboring towns.
Yeah.
They just got 13,000 refugees in 16 days. So they had to draw that number down because with winter coming, they did not have adequate barracks that were heated. So they drew it down fairly quickly to 8,000. I believe now there's about 7,000. And they have the military, they've got a pecking order. This camp will empty its refugees, and then this one, and this one, and this one. Fort McCoy, where I was at, is number 7. So they're working with state and county agencies to relocate these people around the country. For the refugees who have any family ties at all, those families are able to get them right off the base. One of the things I found out is that they're not prisoners on the base. They can walk off the base anytime they want.
Hmm.
But if they do, they're really on their own. So
Yeah.
they don't have access to a lot of the programs and financial support that's being offered. So on the base, you've got all these. In fact, at Fort McCoy, there were 8,000 refugees, and 4,200 of them were children.
Wow.
And our government is doing the best they can to feed them and house them, but the emotional, mental, spiritual challenges they're facing are enormous. They don't speak the language. The food that we're feeding them, in some cases, is making them sick.
Mm.
Just one thing I found out is in the barracks, the lights are either on or they're off. And so you got guys that want to go to sleep at 10 o'clock, and then you have somebody who wants to stay up and play cards. And that can create tension. There's
Yeah.
cases of there's cases of domestic violence and child abuse and all of that stuff that came with them.
Yeah.
So it's a very delicate situation. Big Life was invited at Camp Atterbury in Indiana to come onto the base and be involved in, I don't know all of the military abbreviations, but I did learn MWR, which stands for Morale, Wellness, and Recreation.
Yeah.
So we have been given a building, essentially like a pole barn with a cement slab, to run activities for kids and whatever programs, just to give them something to do. There's a lot of agencies are coming on to these bases. The most critical thing is for these people to learn English, because if they can't speak English, that's very
Yeah. What are you
difficult.
going to do?
They're coming, interestingly, at a time when small businesses and even larger businesses are desperate for workers. I met I won't say his name, but I met a husband and wife and their 4 kids. He is an infectious disease specialist. He's an MD, and his wife was a professor at the University in Kabul of English literature. So they're highly educated. And by the way, most of the highly educated people have moved on. And so, as you begin to pare it down, you come down to people with very, very limited education. Many of them can't read or write. So I don't know exactly how that pecking order works, but in this particular case, the doctor and his wife, and they were begging me, can you do anything to get us off this base? So it just broke my heart. And by the way, if anybody is listening to this and they're actually interested in helping these refugees resettle, like we have one of our Big Life staff lives in Kokomo, Indiana, and I think his house church got together and said, we feel like we can take one family initially and give them housing, find them jobs, that whole thing. And then their plan was to bring 2 or 3 or 4 more families, because there's just a sense of home if you're in a new country, in a new community, but there's at least a few people from your culture who speak your language. But you can go to sponsorcircle.org, and that's a program that the government set up so that if people wanted to at least look into refugees. And the other thing is people can go to Samaritan's Purse. I think their website is probably samaritanspurse.org. That's the organization that Billy Graham's son, Franklin Graham, runs. And I think the Samaritan's Purse has a contract with the US government. So if anybody listening to this is at all interested in sponsoring an Afghan family, sponsorcircle.org or samaritanspurse.org are websites you can explore.
Yep, and I'll put all those in the description below, and we'll go over that at the end again as well for those that are interested. So Big Life, and therefore you were invited to Fort McCoy in the light of this crisis, providing the what did you call it again? The M&R or
Oh yeah. That's I mean, they got all kinds of stuff,
yeah,
but yeah. So we're in charge of morale, well-being, and recreation.
morale, well-being, and recreation.
Yeah, and
So
it's
what all
interesting.
does that? Go ahead.
Well, yeah, that's a good question. What all does that entail?
Yeah.
Well,
I mean,
playing games with kids and so forth. I mean, and helping them playing flashcards, learning whether it's math or letters of the alphabet and so forth. All of that kind of stuff. Just helping kids feel loved, feel safe, feel welcomed. That's a big part of it. But what I'm kind of curious about, and
yeah.
we're this is the proverbial, we are flying the plane as we build it. So I happen to interpret morale and well-being to include their spiritual, moral, psychological well-being.
Mhm.
But you're talking about people. I didn't meet anybody that was. Everybody that I met was a Muslim. So engaging people in matters of faith and talking to them about Jesus is a delicate situation. From the military standpoint, you can see why they would not want, they have kind of a no proselytizing policy. I interpret that to mean, don't get up in public places and, preach sermons and so forth. I do believe that under the guise of their morale and their well-being, not just physical well-being, but their emotional, psychological well-being, there's plenty of room to talk about spiritual things. It's not uncommon when you offer people love and kindness and a listening ear. They kind of look at you and like, who are you?
Mm.
And why are you here? And why do you care? That does open doors. And I think you have to be discreet. You have to be wise. It's certainly helpful if you know something about Islam and about their culture, so that you don't, overstep your bounds and represent God's kingdom in a not very good way. But I do believe that morale and well-being does include, in fact, not only does it include, I think it's central. It's that old saying that people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care.
Yeah.
In fact, I was in the middle of the street. The base is broken up into blocks. There's a 1700 block, the 1800 block, 1900 block, and there's hundreds of people on each block. And I pulled the car over one day and just engaged about 8 men in a conversation. And there was one gentleman who spoke English pretty well. And I told him, and I don't even know if this, if the base, the military knew this, maybe I'd get my hand slapped. But I wanted them to know how sorry I was at how we pulled out of Afghanistan and how it immediately endangered their lives. And the men I was talking to, they were primarily military, and they were extricated out of the country, and they left their wives and their sons and daughters behind. And I looked at them and shared from my heart as best I could how sorry I was as an American citizen. I was embarrassed. And trying to think of the word,
Yeah.
but I was heartbroken at how the U.S. military pulled out in such a chaotic, disheveled way, leaving tens of thousands of people, not to mention U.S. citizens, behind. And I believe they heard my heart, because the gentleman translated, and every one of them, in the little English they could speak, they extended their hand, shook my hand, and said, "Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir." And I could tell by their response that they deeply, deeply appreciated the fact that I was aware of the mental, emotional, and spiritual anguish they were going through, having left wives and children behind. I mean, I thought, what would it
In
be
such a
like?
dangerous circumstance.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And knowing that their wives and children may well be part of the 50% who are starving to death. So Big Life was invited first at Camp Atterbury, and then the other So I think somebody must have gotten a hold of Homeland Security, and they're in such desperate need of volunteers. And we're not the only organization. Samaritan's Purse is there. I found out about an organization I'd never heard of called SOA, which stands for Save Our Allies, I think. They were there. Their volunteers were amazing. And then there's some government agency volunteers, but I think our niche is just providing, at the end of the day, love. We just want to love them well,
Mm-hmm.
and bring healing on whatever level we can.
Appreciate it. Wow. It's really powerful, especially just the fact that you are able to convey your sorrow and your apologies to them, that you understand what they're going through in the moment, because I would imagine that no one else has told them that, or
Well,
very
these are
likely.
people, yeah, and these are people who had this one guy. I won't mention his name, but he's only 22 years old, and he was flying Black Hawk helicopters, and he and his family have worked with the U.S. military. I mean, he's 22 years old. We had been there for 20 years. There are
Wow.
people who literally have been partnering with us, a good bit of their lives.
Mm.
For me, the most heartbreaking part was to see these Afghan men. Now, because of the cultural things, I would see women from a distance, but I would not engage with them. But I would see these Afghan men. They would come out of their barrack, and I think they were depressed, frustrated. They wrapped themselves in blankets, and they would squat down next to the building, and they would just sit there with this vacant look on their face, like, how in the world did I get here? And even though there are things that they can access, classes they can go to, and so forth, my guess is that many of these men are uneducated. They can't read or write Dari or Pashtun, which is their primary languages, or Farsi. So the idea that these illiterate men are now going to come to English classes, it's just completely overwhelming. And
Yeah.
so there's a variety of options for them, activities for them, but I think that they're just so overwhelmed, they're like paralyzed. And I would stop sometimes and just, like do like what we do, just nod my head and smile, and they would sometimes nod back. But there were times where I just wanted to go. My knees would not put up with it, because they'll sit in the squatted position for, that's just
Yeah.
how they. But I wish I could have just sat next and just sat with them and somehow conveyed that your life matters to God,
Mm-hmm.
your life matters to me. So that's hard.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard. It's hard to see people suffering and facing a very, for them, uncertain, frightening future, and becoming very aware of how limited, our resources, whether they're, food or whatever. But
Yeah.
I guess all we can do is all we can do, and trust God for the rest.
Mm-hmm. Amen. I would love to speak more about what exactly Big Life is doing and even more so what God is doing through Big Life. That's the better way to put it. What God's doing through Big Life and through individual disciple-making individuals in Afghanistan and the surrounding areas. Before we do, I would love to get your thoughts. I don't want to get too political here, but I would love to get your thoughts on how permanent perhaps this issue is. I know earlier you mentioned that you were expecting 2 to 3 years, and what I remember a few months ago when this first started, and one of the things that stood out to me was, well, I mean, obviously the speed at which the whole circumstance collapsed, but also at the same time, just the reality that like there's no support net now. I mean, obviously there's plenty of debate about the U.S. being there in the first place, but once we left and now there's nothing else supporting there, I mean, what do you think fills that gap? Obviously, the Taliban's taken a considerable role there. Do you think this is permanent? How do you think how do you think we go from here? I mean, half of the country's starving. I'm sure there's sex slavery rampant.
Yeah,
There's a lot of
yeah.
persecution. And so what do you think happens from here over the next 2, 3, 5, 10 years, if you had to speculate? And how does the church respond in that context?
Well, on the geopolitical, socioeconomic level, um, I think countries like Afghanistan are going to be in for a very, very difficult run. Quite frankly, the best shot that the country has is that God uses those 12,000-ish followers of Jesus to light a spiritual fire in that country where hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Afghans come to faith in Jesus. We know historically, there may be people who are listening to this and like, oh, there you go with your religious blah, blah, blah. But I'm telling you, historically, wherever, and I know we've got some chapters in history that are attached to Christianity, the Dark Ages, the Inquisitions, and so forth, which, by the way, had nothing to do with Jesus. Nothing. His name gets attached to all kinds of nonsense, but wherever true biblical, I hate to use the word Christianity as this world religion, but wherever there is a groundswell of people who follow Jesus, the tide rises for everyone, economically, socially, morally. I remember reading about years ago about a movement in Chiapas, Mexico, where the men would spend all day drinking and beating their wives and so forth, and it was poverty and brokenness and violence. And many people became followers of Jesus, and the men stopped drinking and they started working. And there was economic prosperity, and they stopped beating their wives because the Bible says that husbands are supposed to love their wives. So honestly, the best shot for Afghanistan or any other country is for a massive move of the Spirit of God. That if you want to change a nation, you got to change a heart. It starts here. It starts at the heart level. Now, in the absence of that, with the United States pulling out, I don't think on the geopolitical, socioeconomic level that, I mean, I wish it could be more positive, but I suspect Afghanistan is going to incur massive suffering, and not just Afghanistan, countries like Myanmar, Bhutan. I mean, I could go right down the list of countries where there is evil people leading these governments, and there is unnecessary human atrocity everywhere.
Mm-hmm. And the only hope is Jesus.
Yeah, I know it sounds like this kind of simplistic churchy thing to say, but at a very, very practical level. I mean, I take it down to a micro level of me, my own life.
Yeah.
I mean, many years ago, as a messed up 15-year-old kid, I wasn't even sure if God existed, and I prayed what I would call the first real authentic prayer from my heart, because I was raised in a background where there were memorized prayers, and I had rattled those off a few times. But I basically said, God, I don't even know if you exist, but if you do, I am a mess. And I think when a human being comes to that point where they own, it's not so much the world out there that's run afoul, it's the world in here. Mm-hmm. And when I cried out to God in a spirit of desperation and brokenness, and humility, that was the beginning of a whole new life for me. And it affected everything. So this is not pie in the sky religion. It affected everything from how I mean, Luke, I was a solid D+ student. Solid D+. Me and Tommy Boy. And that was my freshman and sophomore year in high school, because even though I was a good athlete and the class president my freshman year, I was stoned for 2 years, my 9th and 10th grade years. When I surrendered my life to Jesus, I became a straight A student. And the reason for that is I read this verse in the Bible that says, whatever you do, whether in word or deed, do it all to the glory of God in the name of the Lord Jesus. And I went, well, I guess that includes schoolwork. And so I just began. So the point I'm making is that when a person truly, I'm not talking about becoming more religious or going to church more
Yeah.
often.
Doing a ceremony. Yeah.
Yeah, no. I'm talking about at a heart level when Jesus takes away your guilt and shame and he fills your life with what we most crave, which is unconditional love. Because God is God. He's got the goods on us. You can't pull the wool over his eyes. And when you realize that he loves you when you're at your best, when you're at your worst, and that the purpose of Jesus coming at Christmas was ultimately to die on a cross to pay the penalty for our sin. When that went from here to here, I mean, it just blew my life up, and it affected everything. So you multiply my story times hundreds and thousands, and that's why I'm saying if you want to change a nation, it starts at the heart level. And what's so heartbreaking is that we're trying to fix the brokenness of the world. I mean, we're throwing around trillions of dollars in the U.S. right now, it's like candy.
Yeah, and it's not working.
It's not working. In fact, I know this is going to sound harsh, but I believe that we are in the midst right now of the systematic, planned economic rape of the United States.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's a whole nother conversation, and
a whole other conversation.
I could join you on that, but yes, I fully agree that there's a lot that are of serious concern, and obviously there's a wide variety of reasons. But that just to only touch on it and not go too deep down the rabbit hole, I fully agree with you that there are serious problems with the United States, and I wonder if perhaps the United States pulling out of Afghanistan and letting the floor fall out pretty much and just everything splat where it's going to go. I wonder if that's going to happen to many other regions of the world if the United States has serious trouble funding or debts and liabilities. But
I know that the United States cannot be the policeman for the entire planet, but there are select places in the world. In fact, the demilitarized zone of Korea is an example. We don't have thousands and thousands of troops, but we have enough to keep some of the bad actors of North Korea and China at bay. It's the same thing in Afghanistan. That we had pulled all the way down to 1,200 troops, and we were never at war with Afghanistan. We simply established a presence there to keep the Taliban and ISIS at bay, and we were successful in doing that. When we pulled out, it leaves a vacuum. And unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be anybody other than the United States at this point that's going to be able to move in and stabilize that region.
Yeah, unfortunately, as the saying goes, there's no such thing as solutions, only trade-offs. And so so I would love to wrap up here. I really love that you touched on transformation and how God's transformed, how Jesus has transformed your life, and ultimately how you're seeing in Afghanistan, because obviously per the title of the podcast here, I know this is just my first episode, but that's the entire point. And that's why I wanted to talk to you, because as we've outlined, there is serious trouble in Afghanistan. Half these guests that you were with are children, and as you were saying, half of the country is starving or likely to starve, and there's all sorts of horror. But in the midst of that, I've heard some of the stories that you shared about the gospel, and so I would just love to end on that piece of hope. Like, what are some of the, I know you can't get into too many specifics, but what are some of the examples that you've seen of people coming to Christ, or stories you've heard of people leaving the country? Because it sounds like those are the primary ways that people are finding hope there, is that some individuals are leaving, other individuals are having food brought in, and at the baseline of all that, there are heart transformations towards Jesus. So I was wondering if you could speak to that in the light of this horror, where's hope shining through?
Well, I think that there's hope shining through on the military bases because God's people are assembling, not just Big Life, but others. There's a story, I think, coming out of Camp Atterbury, where I think one of the Big Life people who were on that camp ran into one of the Afghan guests, and I don't know what led up to it, but the person said, I have wanted to become a follower of Jesus for some time, because the Arabic word for Jesus is Isa, and Isa is mentioned numerous times in the Quran, and it says things about Isa that it does not say about Muhammad. Yeah, the Quran itself says that Isa was born of a virgin. It says that Isa never sinned. It says that Isa performed miracles. It doesn't say that about Muhammad. And it says, and this is the most interesting thing, it says in the Quran, I think it's Surah 3, verses 42 through 57, it says in that text that those who follow Isa will be with him in paradise. And so if you learn a little bit, you can begin to connect with Muslims, because their plan of salvation is works, works, works,
Yeah.
works. And then if you've done the pilgrimage, if you pray 5 times a day, you do all of those things, and say, do you have any hope of eternal life? And they say, even Muhammad himself was asked, and he said, Allah knows. Nobody knows. There's no assurance. And so that
Yeah.
becomes this overwhelming burden that they carry. And so this gentleman from Afghanistan ran into one of our disciples and says, I've wanted to follow Isa for years. I just don't know how.
Yeah.
And so we have stories like that. We have many, many stories in country, in Afghanistan, Pakistan, of these former Muslims who were willing to give their lives in jihad for a lie.
Mm-hmm.
And now that they have found the truth, they say that our Muslim friends, they're not our enemy. They're victims of the enemy. They just don't know the truth. They don't know the good news. And so, at the risk of their lives, they're carrying the good news of the love of Jesus from village to village. And I can get you resources that have detailed stories coming out of these countries of life
Yeah.
transformation.
Yeah.
We
That would
have
be great.
thousands of them. So
Yeah.
yeah, so in the midst of all of the pain and suffering, the God who came to us at Christmas, and it is still at work in this world, redeeming all of the brokenness until that day when he returns and makes all
Mm-hmm.
things new. So
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate it. How can we help? I know that there's a wide variety of opportunities. I know that we touched on them earlier, but as far as donations, you mentioned that fund and volunteering opportunities. Could you just give us a
yeah,
quick summary
from
of?
the financial standpoint, that's one of the things I actually do with Big Life is I help raise resources, and I'm so happy to do that because I have never, and I at one time I led as you know, I led a
Yeah.
fairly large church. I think at one time we were the largest church
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
northern Michigan,
A very large
north of Grand
church.
Rapids.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. So, but I have never seen a ministry as effective and efficient as Big Life, because Big Life, we don't build buildings. The people who lead these disciple making groups that meet in homes, a house church or a simple church, they're not paid staff. They're doctors and
Yeah.
lawyers and carpenters and whatever. So it's a very efficient model. And so if people wanted to help fuel the movement to provide resources in Afghanistan, or to fuel the movement of reaching the remaining unreached people groups of the world, just go to big.life. That's our website, is www.big.life. And then there will be a button there for giving, and then you can designate where your gifts. That would be one of the most practical things, because that's how that provides the revenue to
Yeah.
purchase the resources that we need to help
Yeah.
those who are suffering in places like Afghanistan. And then when it comes to, if you're at all interested in at least exploring the possibility of sponsoring a refugee family,
Mm-hmm.
either sponsorcircle.org or SamaritansPurse.org.
Yeah.
Either one of those organizations can help you at least begin the exploratory process.
Yeah. Well, that's quite the range of possibilities to help. Whether it's as you're saying, your friend sending $50,
Yeah,
or
yeah,
actually hosting a family.
yeah.
So
There's also a possibility. I'm a little hesitant to throw this out there, but all of these military bases need volunteers. So if you are in the Indianapolis area, you could hit me up, and I could put you in touch with the people who could get you on the base. It's a pretty simple process to get vetted. If you're in the Fort McCoy area, which is northwest Wisconsin, or Fort Bliss, which I don't know where that's at in New Jersey. But if you're like, hey, I would love to go hang out and serve the Afghan people on these bases, there is a way to do that. So feel free to reach out, and we'll see if we can make it happen.
Okay. Well, great. Thank you, Nick. I really appreciate you coming and educating me and all of us on the circumstance, and then what you're doing, what Big Life is doing, what God is doing through all that, and really where we're going from here. So appreciate your time.
Well, Luke, I feel honored that you would invite me on at all, and the fact that this is your first podcast. Thank you, and I hope and pray that this turns into something that for you will be a great blessing, and that through you other people will be blessed.
Thank you. That's the goal. Appreciate it, Nick.
You're welcome.